So in this section and some of the sections that follow, we're going to be talking about all the different ways that you can store data and files within Microsoft Azure. Now we can start by the simplest method, which is using storage accounts. This is where you can store blobs. It also has capacity for tables, queues, and files. Now we're also going to talk later about databases, which includes Azure SQL Database and even Azure Cosmos DB, which is a non-relational data storage. In this section, we're going to be talking about the storage account. Now, a storage account is used for a lot of different things within Azure. If you're going to create a virtual machine, you need a storage account in order to store that virtual hard disk and the files relating. When you create a function, as we just saw, functions also require storage account. Various resources will create storage accounts for you or have you select a storage account. We're going to create a storage account ourselves without any computing infrastructure in front of it. So I'm going to go into here and say add. Alternatively, you can go into the marketplace, find the storage account. We'll go and do that. Find the storage category, and the storage account is the number one item, either way. Now, like a lot of resources, storage account need to be put into resource groups. So I'm going to create a resource group, call it new storage. Now this resource group has to be unique to the region. I don't know why that went away. New storage. Resource group has to be unique to the region, and so it should be fine calling it pretty much whatever you wish. Now the storage account name. Now storage accounts by default are actually publicly accessible. You do need security keys in order to access it, but this is going to end up being a URL that's accessible on the internet. That's why the name must be unique across all existing storage accounts in Azure. So across all of Azure. That's why I like to use my unique prefix, the AZSJD. Now I already have a storage account called this, so I'll call it 2. Now the location. Now it makes sense that you want to store your files in a location that's closest to the people and applications that are going to use it. If you're going to have your applications running in Europe, then it doesn't make sense to have the files that those applications need in the United States. So keep your applications and your files close together. Those can be close to the users. Now, in a fully highly available and fast response application, you might have to put this into multiple locations. But for now, just choose the location that makes the most sense. Now, one of the first major decisions we have is this concept of performance. Performance is basically whether the storage account is going to be using a magnetic disk, the traditional spinning disk, which are hard disk drives. This is the lowest cost, and it also has a big capacity. So if you need storage that's going to be in the multiple terabytes, then you might want to consider standard performance. Now, premium storage uses the solid state drives, those flash memory. It's a lot quicker. So in terms of the read and write performance, it's a lot quicker, a little bit more expensive, and the maximum capacity, it will not be as much as a traditional spinning disk. Now, in these times when you're dealing with virtual machines, then you might want to consider premium disks. Okay, so unless you have a really good reason to have standard or price really is going to be a huge consideration, then my advice would be to choose the premium disk. Now I'm going to tell you about both of those options. Let's start with the standard storage. Now for most of your purposes of creating a storage account, you're going to want to choose storage v2. This will be, 95% of the options out there. Storage, a general purpose v1, as the name implies, is the older model of storage. There are only a couple of use cases for why you'd want to store in v1. One of them is if you got virtual machines or other resources running in the classic deployment model, the ASM model. So storage v2 only supports ARM, the Azure Resource Manager model, which is the modern way of deploying resources in Azure. The ARM, by the way, is the only model covered on the test, so you will never need to know much about the classic model or how to work with it. But in real life, if you've got to work with the classic model for any reason, you might have to go to the storage model. Now, the other thing for V1 is, of course, um, it is a little bit more economical if you're doing a lot of transactions. So if you are recording millions of transactions to your storage account back and forth, then the storage V2 has a different pricing model. Okay. Now, finally, there are blob storage accounts. Now, blob storage accounts are very specialized and only allows for block blobs. Now, blob storage accounts basically have access tiers where you can basically make this blob storage account public. So if you want to have anonymous access to your storage account, which is generally a terrible idea in most situations, but if you really do need your website to use the blob storage account as the source of the images displayed to the general public, for instance, then perhaps you want to create a blob storage account just for those things that don't need access, okay? But Microsoft recommends a V2 for most situations. The next decision you have in terms of georeplication. So there are 4 types of georeplication: locally redundant, zone redundant, geo-redundant, and read access geo-redundant. Locally redundant is when you have basically data that is kept in 3 total locations within a data center. So let's say you've got we're here in central US, then Microsoft Azure is automatically, without us having to do anything, going to store 2 additional copies of our files. So even in the worst case scenario, when a particular data center goes down or the hard disk that is storing our files gets corrupted or dies, they've got 2 backup copies and they'll automatically basically fix that for us. It's a self-healing system. You don't have to do anything. So by default, you get 3 total copies of your data in locally redundant storage. Now, in zone redundant storage, it's basically an additional layer of what's called high availability or durability. So the data then is going to be stored in 3 availability zones. Remember, we were talking about availability zones in the virtual machine section. So this LRS is in 1 availability zone. Zone redundant storage is 3 copies stored in the 3 availability zones. Okay, so and the pricing is the same for LRS and ZRS. So you get that additional durability, additional high availability, and pretty much for the same price. Now, when you want to go into geo-redundant storage, that's the next tier up. There is an upgrade in terms of the cost. Then Microsoft's going to keep 6 copies of your data. That is the original copy plus 5 additional. That also means they're going to take your data outside of the region. So the data will leave central US region into other regions in order to maximize this availability. Okay. Now, finally, the read access GRS, as the name implies, means that not only is the data stored in other regions, but you have access to it in a read-only fashion. So if you do want to have your primary data storage in Central Region and your geo-redundant storage, in Eastern Europe or something like that, and you want to be able to read that data, then you can have read access storage, and your application would have to implement the secondary URL for that in the cases of where it just needs to read. Now, the access tier, basically, in this case, it's cool and hot. And there's another one called archive, but archive tier is not at the storage account level, it's at an individual blob level. Now, hot storage is the default, and it just means you implementing the standard read and write and the standard pricing, the standard performance. Basically, your data is available to you anytime that you need it, instantly. For cool access, basically you're going to You're basically promising Microsoft you're going to keep your data for at least 30 days there, and it's a little bit cheaper. It's going to cost you a little bit more to access it. So this is really good for like backups. This is where you do a backup, you put it somewhere. It might be a lot of data, so it'd be nicer to save a little bit of money, but you don't really need microsecond access to a backup once it's been backed up. You might need access to it in an emergency, but anyways, the cool access tier is basically higher cost to access, lower cost to store, and it's great for things that you're not going to access very frequently. Now, finally, archive tier, which again is not shown on screen, is even more so. You're going to promise 180 days that you're not going to access it. It's going to take hours for you to get that data. So if you start to mark blobs as archival blobs, then you're willing to give you're willing to take 24 hours to get your data back, but that's your maximum savings. So we're going to leave the hot storage access for now. I'm going to pause the video. We'll come back and we'll continue on the creation of our storage account.